Welcome to Worldview, a conversation with world leaders talking about global issues relevant to international education. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Helen Clark, former Administrator of the United Nations Development Program and former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Helen, welcome to Worldview. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
You have been, most recently, the head of the United Nations Development Program. Would you like to share with our audience a bit more about what UNDP does?
Well, UNDP is 51 years old, founded in 1966, with U Thant, who was the UN Secretary General, saying this organisation is going to lead the global fight against poverty for the UN. And he brought together two predecessor organisations, an expanded technical fund and a special fund, and launched UNDP to lead the system. And that's what it's been doing for 51 years at the UN, and has established a good reputation as a major multilateral development organisation. It has signature products like the annual Human Development Report globally and the Human Development Index, which I can assure you as a former Prime Minister, we all take a lot of interest in where our country ranks on the Human Development Index. And relevant to NAFSA is that education is one of the three core components of Human Development Index. So we know just how important it is. So UNDP's been out there with a universal presence in developing countries, with very broad support among donor countries, developed countries, including the United States of America. And it's worked on poverty eradication, linked it to environment, because you can't eradicate poverty if the poor have their living standards constantly eroded by dramatic impacts on the environment, whether it's climate change or loss of biodiversity. And it works on governance, supporting countries to be better governed, more responsive, more inclusive, more cohesive. And it works on crisis response, whether it's a big natural disaster or whether it's war and conflict.
Indeed. UNDP plays such a central role. Of course, you came in as a former Prime Minister. You had already been a head of government. How did that experience shape your approach to your work at UNDP?
What I found was that because I'd been in New Zealand politics a very, very long time, like about 40 years, and a very, very long time in the New Zealand Parliament, that I'd worked on so many areas of public policy. And all of them were relevant to UNDP because you're interacting with developing countries that are trying to improve their systems, build their capacities, improve their policy, their regulation, get things done. And when you've been a political leader and Prime Minister and Minister, you like to get things done. You like to design a policy that's going to work and see the results of it. So I brought all that experience to the job.
And indeed, it was a very full agenda. In 2015, the nations of the world supported the Sustainable Development Goals. How will the Sustainable Development Goals affect the planning of countries around the world?
Well, developing countries, and quite a lot of developed countries, have really taken that agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals to heart. For UNDP, we've been leading an effort to support countries to mainstream the goals into their national plans. Now, developed countries tend not to have national plans. Mine never did. But developing countries do tend to have a national development plan. Now, global agendas are a fine thing, but they are words on paper unless it goes into the national plan and into the policies and into the budget. So that's an exercise we've been pushing very hard, really, for the last couple of years, with a tremendous response. More than 100 of the UN country teams led by UNDP around the world have been asked for support by developing countries with mainstreaming this agenda. So that's really how we're propelling it forward. It's not a matter of, yap at the global level. It's a question of, are countries going to take it seriously? Will they change their policy framework and budget to make it happen?
I think that's a really important point for observers to understand, as you say, is the introduction of ideas from the SDGs into national plans, and that as leaders are thinking about what they're doing in their own countries, that they're drawing on this important framework. Within the SDGs, Goal 4 talks about education. How in particular do you see the role of education within development and within the SDGs?
Well, as I said, education is a core component of human development. And the Human Development Index and paradigm was drawn up as a response to the tyranny of GDP as a measure of progress, and also as something of a correction to the structural adjustment period of earlier years, where UNICEF came up with development with a human face under Jim Grant. So UNDP's paradigm very much fits that alternative model to say, look, money's important, but it's not everything. Are people educated? Are they healthy? So we always measure the education component. Now, the truth is, no country is going to develop to its full potential unless its people are educated. And the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, talked about universal access to primary education. Great, but that's just a building block. The next block is you need to be able to get into secondary schooling. You know, my country introduced free secondary schooling in the 1930s. Where would we be today if we hadn't introduced free secondary schooling? So education is so fundamental. Education is power. Education for women is a way to break out of all the constraints that society's put around women. It's just fundamental. So it is a core sustainable development goal, like it was a core Millennium Development Goal, and it needs to be core to every country's national development plan.
As you mentioned, equal access to education for men and women is a fundamental approach within the both Millennium Development and particularly Sustainable Development Goals. And even tertiary education is mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals. Are there steps you think are particularly important to help encourage equal access to education for men and women?
Yes, and it's not just a matter of schools being free and accessible. We have societies where girls are married off very, very young against their will. And so to get every girl in school, you have to work against that sentiment. You have to advocate for girls to be able to finish their education and make their own choices of when or if they will marry, when or if they will have children, what sort of life do they want to lead. That's why education is so empowering for girls. Now, the Millennium Development Goal in education was relatively successful. We didn't get there. It was said at the end of 2015 that 57 million children were still out of school. Half of them were in sub-Saharan Africa. If we cut the pie another way, half were in countries affected by conflict. So there's still work to do, but there was a lot of progress made in the Millennium Development Goal period because countries knew that universal access to primary education was the goal, and people wanted to do the best they could. Now, let me give you a practical example. I recall going to Burkina Faso in 2010, and their progress report at that point said that 66% of their children were in primary school. Now, we could think, gosh, that's terrible, that's low. But then I looked at the literacy rates for adults, which were under 30%. So even 66 was just such a huge advance on where they'd been. And you can see how to encourage to go the next mile. For a very poor country like Burkina Faso, it does need international support. It needs budget support for its education, but it is doable.
Indeed. NAFSA is the professional home of people who work on international education, including the exchange of students and scholars, both sending students internationally and welcoming international students in their countries, which is an important movement of people. We since very much support the movement of people and ideas. How does the exchange of students and scholars contribute either to development or to education globally?
Well, it definitely contributes because people who have the opportunity to study abroad, exchange abroad, come home with new ideas. And that's development, isn't it? It's taking on board new ideas, looking at how you might adapt them to your own environment, innovate from there. It's the continual exchange of ideas, so I'm all for it. You know, I grew up in an era in New Zealand where opportunities for this were so limited. It was just unheard of, really, for your school to have an exchange program with another school. I went through my entire education without that. So I look at the opportunities for young people today and think, how incredible, what path would my life have taken if I'd had those opportunities? Maybe I would have ended up offshore and not Prime Minister of New Zealand, so maybe I had the best choice anyway. But just so many more opportunities today.
NAFSA, so by the very work they do, support bringing people together. Building bridges, not walls, is something we often say. Yet, these days, we see something of a pushback, a resistance against creating bridges internationally. Some people seem to want to retreat into nationalist, populist environments. What do you see in the world today, and what do you think we should do about it?
Well, my opinion on this is substantially that I expressed in a speech at the International Labour Organization in 2004, when the topic was a report they produced on the social impacts of globalization. And I said then, 13 years ago, that my concern was that the way that globalization had proceeded had created a world that was fit for the movement of capital and companies, but had left a lot of people behind. And I think in these election results we're seeing in parts of the developed world now, we're really seeing the revenge of the people who've been left behind in the Rust Belts, the people who've been excluded. And they look at perhaps the way or the part their country's playing in the world, and they say, well, what about me? I was left behind. I haven't had a job for years since my company packed up and went somewhere else. And what it tells us is that actually developed countries need to think a bit about how they plan their economic and social transitions too. Because if it's cold turkey, as the phrase goes, you will leave people behind, you will create bitterness and resentment and an inward lookingness. And I think that is avoidable. Let's learn from the societies like the Scandinavian ones, which tend to adjust better, have more labour market planning, more commitment to accessible, affordable, continual education.
Indeed, the importance of continuing education is something I think we will be looking at in terms of the contribution of international education to that area. In a sense, we're talking about lifelong learning in a way maybe we didn't do in the past.
Well, when I was Prime Minister, we used to say that 80% of today's 5-year-olds will be doing jobs which have not yet been invented. So what does that tell us? It tells us we need education which enables us to access the information we need, to be very flexible, have a good general knowledge base, but we can't just train for one narrow thing and think that'll take us through life. It won't.
Indeed. There's so much work we have to do in terms of helping everyone develop the skills that will help them now and in the future.
Yeah.
Helen Clark, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us here on Worldview for NAFSA. Thank you.
Thank you.